The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of Murphy's Diner as Sarah Martinez pulled her worn Honda Civic into a space near the back. She preferred the quiet corners, away from the main flow of customers who might notice the slight tremor in her hands or the way she sometimes startled at sudden noises. The small-town diner had become her sanctuary over the past 6 months since she'd moved to Cedar Falls, a place where she could blend into the background and try to piece together what remained of her shattered life. Sarah stepped out of her car, adjusting the sleeves of her long-sleeved shirt despite the warm September weather. The fabric covered the intricate tattoos that decorated her forearms, designs that told a story she wasn't ready to share with anyone in this quiet Minnesota town. She had learned to keep them hidden after too many curious stares and uncomfortable questions from well-meaning strangers who couldn't understand why a young woman would mark her skin with such bold, military-inspired artwork. The bell above Murphy's front door chimed softly as she entered, and Dolores, the 60-something waitress with kind eyes and silver hair, waved from behind the counter. "Morning, honey. Your usual spot is open." Sarah nodded gratefully and made her way to the corner booth where she had claimed residency most mornings for the past several months. It offered her a clear view of both entrances and kept her back to the wall, old habits that she couldn't seem to shake no matter how safe this small town felt. Cedar Falls had drawn her in with its promise of anonymity. After the chaos of her previous life, the predictable rhythm of a place where the biggest news was usually about high school football scores or the annual corn festival felt like a balm to her wounded soul. She had found a small apartment above the used bookstore on Main Street and a part-time job at the local veterinary clinic, work that allowed her to channel her medical training into helping creatures that couldn't ask questions about her past. Dr. Williams, the clinic's owner, had been surprised by her extensive knowledge of emergency medical procedures when she'd applied for the job. She had explained it away as pre-med courses from college, a half-truth that seemed to satisfy his curiosity. The work was rewarding in a way that felt both familiar and completely different from her previous life. Here, she saved injured animals instead of patching up wounded soldiers under fire. The stakes felt lower, but the satisfaction of healing remained the same. As Dolores approached with a steaming cup of black coffee, Sarah pulled out a worn paperback novel, using it as a shield against unwanted conversation. She had become an expert at appearing busy, at creating invisible barriers that kept people at a comfortable distance. It wasn't that the residents of Cedar Falls weren't friendly, quite the opposite, actually. Their kindness sometimes overwhelmed her, reminding her of the camaraderie she had lost and could never reclaim. "You're looking a bit better today," Dolores observed, setting down the coffee along with a plate of scrambled eggs and whole wheat toast that Sarah hadn't ordered but had become her standard breakfast. The older woman had taken it upon herself to ensure Sarah ate regularly, having noticed the way her clothes hung loose on her frame when she'd first started coming in. Sarah managed a small smile. "Thanks, Dolores. The sleep has been better." It was mostly true. The nightmares still came, but less frequently now, and she had learned to manage the anxiety that sometimes gripped her without warning. The move to Cedar Falls had been the right choice, she told herself daily. Here, she could heal. Here, she could forget. The diner's atmosphere changed subtly when the morning regulars began filtering in. There was Jim Morrison, the retired postal worker who held court at the counter with his opinions about everything from weather to politics. Betty and Harold Kowalski, married for 52 years, who shared a booth and finished each other's sentences. And then, there were the younger crowd, teachers from the high school, nurses from the small hospital, and various business owners starting their day with caffeine and community gossip. Sarah observed them all with the trained eye of someone accustomed to reading people and situations. It was another habit from her past life that she couldn't quite shake, this constant assessment of her environment and the people in it. She told herself it was just caution, but deep down she knew it was more than that. Some instincts, once honed to a razor's edge, never quite dulled. The conversation at a nearby table caught her attention despite her attempts to remain focused on her book. 3 men in their 50s and 60s were discussing their military service, sharing stories with the easy familiarity of veterans who had found each other in civilian life. She recognized the cadence of their speech, the way they referenced places and experiences that civilians wouldn't understand. They wore baseball caps with unit insignias and spoke with the particular brand of dark humor that helped soldiers cope with the weight of their experiences. "I'm telling you, Frank, kids today have no idea what real service means," one of them was saying, his voice carrying the slight edge of a man who felt his sacrifices had been forgotten. "They see these movies and think they know what it's all about. Hell, half of them probably think you can just walk into a recruiting office and become a Navy SEAL next week." The others laughed, but there was a bitter quality to the sound. Sarah's hand tightened around her coffee mug as she listened, memories threatening to surface despite her efforts to keep them buried. She knew exactly what real service meant, what it cost, and what it took from you even after you thought you had given everything.
Remember that woman last year over in Minneapolis? Frank continued.
Claimed she was special forces, had all the gear, even the tattoos. Turned out she'd never served a day in her life.
Stolen valor makes my blood boil.
Sarah's stomach clenched. Stories like that had become more common in recent years, and they cast suspicion on anyone whose service couldn't be easily verified. She understood the anger of legitimate veterans who felt their sacrifices were being diminished by imposters, but she also knew how complicated the truth could be when official records didn't tell the whole story. The conversation drifted to other topics, but Sarah found herself unable to concentrate on her book. The weight of her own secrets pressed down on her like a physical thing, making it hard to breathe in the suddenly stuffy diner. She had thought that moving to a small town would mean leaving the complications of her past behind, but she was beginning to realize that some things followed you no matter how far you ran. Her phone buzzed with a text message, startling her from her brooding thoughts. It was Dr. Williams, asking if she could come in early to help with an emergency surgery on a dog that had been hit by a car. Sarah quickly finished her breakfast, grateful for the distraction that work would provide. As she stood to leave, she caught Dolores's eye and left money on the table along with a generous tip. "See you tomorrow, honey," Dolores called out, and Sarah waved in response, not trusting her voice to remain steady. The veterinary clinic was only a 10-minute walk from the diner, a journey that took her down Main Street past the bookstore where she lived, the small library with its weekly community events posted on a bulletin board, and the park where families brought their children to play on weekends. It was the kind of town where people waved at strangers and left their doors unlocked, a level of trust and innocence that both comforted and unnerved her. Dr. Williams was waiting for her when she arrived, his usually calm demeanor showing signs of stress. The injured dog, a German Shepherd mix, was unconscious on the examination table, its breathing shallow and labored. Sarah's training kicked in immediately, her hands moving with practiced efficiency as she helped prepare for surgery. In these moments, when life hung in the balance, her past became an asset rather than a burden. "I don't know how you learned to work under pressure like this," Dr. Williams commented as they worked to stabilize the animal. "Most vet techs take months to develop this kind of composure in emergencies." Sarah focused on monitoring the dog's vital signs, avoiding his curious gaze. "I guess I just handle stress well," she replied, which was both completely true and utterly inadequate as an explanation. She had learned to handle stress in environments where hesitation meant death, where split-second decisions determined whether her teammates went home to their families or came back in flag-draped coffins. The surgery was successful, and, as they cleaned up afterward, Dr. Williams suggested that Sarah consider going back to school to become a full veterinarian. "You have natural instincts for this work," he said. "And your medical knowledge is impressive for someone who supposedly only took pre-med courses." The comment was casual, but Sarah detected the underlying question. She had been careless, allowing too much of her real training to show through. In her previous life, she had been a Navy hospital corpsman attached to a SEAL team, trained in battlefield medicine and emergency trauma care. Her knowledge went far beyond what any pre-med student would possess, and she realized she needed to be more careful about revealing the depth of her expertise. That evening, Sarah sat in her small apartment above the bookstore, staring at the box she kept hidden in her bedroom closet. It contained the physical reminders of who she used to be, commendation letters, photographs with faces she would never see again, and the discharge papers that told only a fraction of her story. She had avoided looking through these items since moving to Cedar Falls, afraid that they would pull her back into the darkness she was fighting so hard to escape. But the conversation in the diner that morning had stirred something in her, a restless feeling that she couldn't quite identify. She pulled the box from its hiding place and sat on her bed, running her fingers over the worn cardboard edges before finally lifting the lid. The first thing she saw was a photograph of her SEAL team, taken during a brief respite between missions. They were all there: Marcus with his infectious grin, Thompson trying to look serious for the camera but failing, Rodriguez making bunny ears behind Johnson's head. And there she was in the middle, the only woman among them, looking fierce and confident and utterly certain of her place in their brotherhood. They had called her Doc because of her medical training, but also because of her calm competence under fire. She had earned their respect through countless dangerous missions, proving herself again and again in situations where gender became irrelevant compared to skill and courage. They had been her family, her purpose, her entire world. The photograph blurred as tears filled her eyes. Of the 8 people in that picture, only 3 were still alive, and she was the only one who had walked away from that final mission relatively intact. The others were either dead or so severely wounded that they would never serve again. And she, the survivor, had been given an honorable discharge and a chest full of medals that felt more like accusations than honors.
The official story was that Petty Officer First Class Sarah Martinez had suffered a traumatic brain injury during an IED explosion that had also killed 4 of her teammates.
The injury had affected her memory and cognitive function enough to make her unfit for further military service, though she had recovered remarkably well considering the severity of her wounds. What the official story didn't mention was that her recovery had involved months of psychological therapy to deal with survivor's guilt and post-traumatic stress that left her unable to sleep without nightmares or function in crowds without panic attacks. The Navy had been generous with her medical care and disability benefits, recognizing that her service had gone above and beyond what was expected of a hospital corpsman. But generosity couldn't restore her sense of purpose or bring back the men who had died under her care. It couldn't erase the memory of trying desperately to save Marcus while enemy fire rained down around them, or the sight of Thompson's vacant eyes after the explosion that took half his skull. Sarah carefully returned the photograph to the box and pulled out her discharge papers. The official language was cold and bureaucratic, failing to capture the complexity of a service career that had been cut short by circumstances beyond anyone's control. According to the paperwork, she had served with distinction for 6 years, receiving numerous commendations for valor and medical expertise in combat situations. But buried in the medical discharge section were references to classified operations that couldn't be detailed in an unclassified document. That was the problem with covert operations, they left gaps in the official record that could make someone's service look questionable to those who didn't have security clearances high enough to access the full truth. Sarah's actual service record was largely classified, hidden behind black ink and security protocols that would remain in place for decades. To anyone conducting a casual background check, she looked like a hospital corpsman with an unusually short service record and a mysterious medical discharge. She had been warned about this by her commanding officer before her discharge. Martinez, Captain Rodriguez had said, his weathered face showing the strain of losing too many good sailors under his command. Your real record is going to be classified for a long time. If anyone ever questions your service, you have my personal contact information and the number for the Navy Personnel Command's Classified Records Division. Don't let anyone make you feel ashamed of what you've sacrificed for this country. But Sarah had moved to Cedar Falls specifically to avoid having to explain her service to anyone. She wanted to disappear into anonymity, to build a new life where she could be just another small-town resident with an unremarkable past. The thought of having to contact her former commanding officer or deal with military bureaucracy to verify her credentials made her feel sick with anxiety. The sound of laughter from the street below drew her to the window. A group of teenagers was walking past, probably heading home from the high school football game that had been the talk of the town all week. They looked so young and carefree, untouched by the kind of experiences that had aged her beyond her 28 years. She envied their innocence while simultaneously feeling protective of it. Sarah closed the box and returned it to its hiding place in the closet. Tomorrow she would go back to the diner, back to her job at the clinic, back to the careful routine she had built to keep the demons at bay. She would continue to hide her tattoos and deflect questions about her past, hoping that the growing sense of belonging she felt in Cedar Falls would eventually outweigh the weight of her secrets. But, as she prepared for bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that her carefully constructed new life was more fragile than she had believed. The conversation in the diner had reminded her that there were people in every community who took military service seriously, who would not hesitate to challenge someone they suspected of misrepresenting their record. And if that day ever came, Sarah would have to decide whether to reveal the truth about who she really was or risk being branded as the very thing she despised, someone who had stolen valor that wasn't rightfully theirs. The irony was bitter and inescapable. She, who had earned her place among some of the most elite warriors in the military, would appear to be exactly what she was not, a fraud trading on the sacrifices of others. And, in a small town where reputation was everything and secrets were hard to keep, that perception could destroy the fragile peace she had worked so hard to build. As she finally drifted off to sleep, Sarah's last conscious thought was a prayer to a God she wasn't sure she still believed in. Please, just let me have a little more time to heal. Just a little more time to figure out how to live with what I've lost and who I used to be. But, in her dreams, she was back in the desert, trying desperately to save Marcus while the sound of helicopters filled the air and enemy fire lit up the night sky. And, when she woke, gasping and covered in sweat, she knew that time was a luxury she might not be granted, no matter how far she ran or how carefully she tried to hide. 3 weeks after the conversation in Murphy's diner that had shaken Sarah's carefully maintained composure, the annual Cedar Falls Veterans Day celebration was approaching. The entire town seemed to buzz with preparation as residents organized parades, memorial services, and community gatherings to honor those who had served. Sarah watched the growing excitement with a mixture of appreciation and deep unease, knowing that such events often brought increased scrutiny of anyone claiming military connections. The autumn air carried the scent of burning leaves and the promise of winter as Sarah made her way to work at the veterinary clinic. Main Street was already decorated with American flags and yellow ribbon banners, while storefronts displayed photographs of local veterans from conflicts spanning from World War II to Afghanistan. She paused briefly in front of Kowalski's hardware store, where Harold had created a memorial wall featuring pictures of Cedar Falls residents who had served, some who had returned home and others who had not. Her breath caught when she saw a familiar face among the photographs: Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, who had grown up in Cedar Falls before enlisting in the Army. Sarah had never met Torres personally, but she recognized him from intelligence briefings during her time downrange. He had been killed by an IED just 2 months before her own team's final mission, and seeing his smiling face among the honored dead brought back the crushing weight of survivor's guilt that she fought every day. "Terrible loss, that boy," a voice said behind her. Sarah turned to find Margaret Henley, the town librarian, standing with her arms full of books and a sad expression on her weathered face. "His mother still comes to the library every week, reads everything she can find about the war, trying to understand what happened to her son." Sarah nodded silently, not trusting herself to speak. The randomness of death in combat zones was something she understood all too well: how one person could step on an IED and die instantly while their teammate, walking just 5 feet away, survived without a scratch. There was no logic to it, no cosmic justice that determined who went home and who didn't. It was simply the brutal mathematics of war, and it left survivors like her to carry the weight of inexplicable fortune. "Are you planning to attend the ceremony on Sunday?" Margaret asked, apparently mistaking Sarah's silence for respectful contemplation rather than barely controlled emotion. "It's always such a moving tribute. We honor all our veterans, from the oldest World War II survivors down to the young ones just back from overseas." "I'm not sure," Sarah managed. "I might be working." It was a lie, but the thought of standing in a crowd of veterans, possibly being asked about her own service, made her stomach clench with anxiety. She had learned to manage her PTSD symptoms well enough to function in daily life, but large gatherings still triggered her hypervigilance and flight responses. Margaret's expression grew curious. "Oh, that's too bad. Dr. Williams mentioned you had some medical training. Did you serve in the military by any chance?" "We always like to recognize all our veterans, even the newer residents." The question Sarah had been dreading hit her like a physical blow. She forced herself to remain calm while her mind raced through possible responses. The truth was too complicated, but an outright lie felt like a betrayal of everything she had sacrificed. "I prefer not to talk about it," she said finally, which was completely honest if not particularly informative. "Of course, dear. I understand completely," Margaret replied, though her expression suggested she was filing this information away for future consideration. In a small town, people remembered conversations like this, and Sarah realized she had just confirmed Margaret's suspicions that there was more to her past than she had previously revealed. The rest of the day passed in a haze of anxiety as Sarah tried to focus on her work at the clinic. Dr. Williams noticed her distraction during a routine surgery on a cat, commenting that she seemed unusually tense. She blamed it on a poor night's sleep, which was partially true. Her dreams had been particularly vivid lately, filled with the faces of teammates she would never see again and the sound of gunfire that seemed to echo even in waking moments. That evening, Sarah made a decision that surprised herself. Instead of going straight home to her apartment, she drove to the outskirts of town where a small VA clinic provided basic services to veterans in the rural area. She had avoided any contact with Veterans Affairs since moving to Cedar Falls, afraid that accessing services might somehow reveal her location to people from her past who might ask uncomfortable questions. The clinic was housed in a modest building that had once been a family medical practice, and the parking lot contained a mix of pickup trucks, older sedans, and motorcycles that suggested a diverse group of veterans seeking services. Sarah sat in her car for 10 minutes, watching people come and go, before finally working up the courage to enter. The waiting room was small and comfortable, decorated with photographs of local landmarks and staffed by a receptionist who looked to be in her 30s with the bearing of someone who had served herself. Sarah approached the desk hesitantly, still unsure of exactly what she hoped to accomplish by being there. "Can I help you?" the receptionist asked with a warm smile. Her name tag read Jessica and included a small pin indicating she was a Navy veteran. "I was wondering about counseling services," Sarah said quietly. "I've been having some trouble adjusting, and I thought maybe it would help to talk to someone who understands." Jessica's expression grew more serious as she pulled out an intake form. "Are you a veteran?" Sarah nodded, then hesitated before adding, "My discharge was medical, and some of my records are classified. It might be complicated to verify." "Don't worry about that right now," Jessica said reassuringly. "Dr. Peterson, our counselor, is a retired Navy psychiatrist who's dealt with classified situations before. He's more interested in helping than in paperwork. Can you come in tomorrow afternoon?" He had a cancellation. Sarah agreed and filled out the basic information requested, careful to note that her military records required security clearance to access fully. As she left the clinic, she felt a mixture of relief and terror at having taken this step. Seeking help felt like admitting defeat, but she was beginning to realize that her attempts at complete self-reliance were not sustainable in the long term. The next afternoon, Sarah found herself sitting across from Dr. Peterson, a soft-spoken man in his 60s whose gentle demeanor immediately put her at ease. His office was decorated with naval memorabilia that suggested he understood military culture from the inside, and he asked questions that demonstrated genuine familiarity with the unique challenges facing combat veterans. "Tell me about the transition," he said after they had covered the basics of her background. "What's been the most difficult part of civilian life?" Sarah had prepared for questions about trauma and nightmares, but this practical inquiry caught her off guard. She found herself talking about the isolation she felt, the way civilian problems seemed simultaneously trivial and overwhelming, and the constant vigilance that made it hard to relax in social situations. She spoke about the guilt of surviving when others hadn't, and the way her classified service record made it difficult to seek help or connect with other veterans. "It sounds like you're carrying a lot of burdens alone," Dr. Peterson observed. "Have you considered that your reluctance to discuss your service might be making things harder rather than easier?" "People wouldn't understand," Sarah said. "And, if they knew the truth, they might treat me differently. I just want to be normal." Dr. Peterson leaned forward slightly. "Sarah, normal is relative. What you experienced downrange, what you survived, that's not something you can just put behind you by pretending it never happened. Integration doesn't mean denial." They talked for nearly an hour, and, when Sarah left, she had an appointment for the following weekend, a prescription for sleep aids to help with the nightmares. More importantly, she had a growing sense that she might not have to carry her burdens entirely alone. Unfortunately, her steps toward healing would soon be interrupted by circumstances beyond her control. The Veterans Day celebration in Cedar Falls began early on Sunday morning with a memorial service at the town cemetery, followed by a parade down Main Street and concluding with a community lunch at the high school gymnasium. Sarah had intended to avoid the entire event, but Dr. Williams had asked her to be on call in case any of the aging veterans needed medical assistance during the festivities. She positioned herself near the back of the crowd gathered around the cemetery's memorial wall, trying to remain inconspicuous while keeping an eye on several elderly veterans who looked unsteady on their feet. The ceremony was moving and respectful, with speakers who clearly understood the weight of military sacrifice. Sarah found herself unexpectedly touched by the genuine appreciation the community showed for its veterans. The trouble began during the parade, when Frank Morrison, one of the men from the diner, spotted her in the crowd and approached with several other local veterans. Sarah recognized the look in their eyes. They had been drinking at the VFW hall before the parade and were feeling particularly patriotic and protective of military honor. "Excuse me, miss," Frank said, his voice carrying the slight edge of alcohol and righteous indignation. "Word around town is that you might have served in the military. Is that true?" Sarah felt her heart rate spike as she realized this was the confrontation she had been dreading. Around them, other parade watchers began to take notice of the conversation, and she could see curiosity and suspicion growing on several faces. "I prefer not to discuss it," she said, using the same response that had worked with Margaret at the library. "See, here's the thing," Frank continued, moving closer in a way that made Sarah's combat instincts flare. "We take military service seriously in this town. And, lately, there's been too many people claiming they served when they didn't. So when someone new shows up and won't talk about their service, it raises questions." Another veteran, whom Sarah didn't recognize, joined the conversation.
We heard you've got military tattoos under those long sleeves. Mind showing us?
The crowd around them was growing larger, and Sarah realized she was in an impossible position. Revealing her tattoos would lead to more questions she couldn't answer, but refusing to do so would only increase their suspicions. Her breathing became shallow as the familiar signs of a panic attack began to manifest. "I don't have to prove anything to you," she said, her voice shaking slightly despite her efforts to remain calm. Frank's expression hardened. "Actually, you do. Stolen valor is a crime, and if you're running some kind of scam in our town, we're going to find out about it." Before Sarah could respond, someone in the crowd called out that they should contact the police. Within minutes, Officer Danny Chen, a young policeman who took his duties very seriously, was pushing through the gathering crowd to investigate the disturbance.
"What seems to be the problem here?"
Officer Chen asked, his hand resting casually on his radio as he assessed the situation. Frank immediately launched into his suspicions about Sarah's military claims, embellishing details and presenting her reluctance to discuss her service as evidence of deception. Other voices joined in, creating a chorus of accusations that painted her as a fraud preying on the community's respect for veterans. Sarah stood in the middle of the growing crowd, feeling trapped and increasingly panicked as more people arrived to see what was happening. The noise and press of bodies around her triggered memories of the confusion and chaos that had followed the IED explosion that killed her teammates. She could hear helicopters that weren't there and smell smoke that existed only in her memory. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see some identification," Officer Chen said, apparently deciding that the safest course was to treat the accusations seriously until they could be resolved. Sarah fumbled for her wallet with hands that shook visibly, and the crowd murmured at this apparent sign of guilt. She handed over her driver's license, which showed her current address but provided no information about military service.
"The allegations are that you've been falsely claiming military service," Officer Chen explained. "Do you have any documentation that proves you served in the military?"
"My records are classified," Sarah said, knowing how ridiculous it sounded even as the words left her mouth. "I can provide contact information for verification, but it might take time."
Frank snorted derisively.
"Classified records. Right. That's what they all say." The situation was spiraling out of control, and Sarah realized that her attempts to avoid this exact scenario had only made it inevitable. In her desperation to protect her privacy and avoid difficult questions about her past, she had created exactly the kind of suspicious circumstances that would naturally raise questions about stolen valor. Officer Chen was clearly uncomfortable with the situation but seemed to feel that he had no choice but to take the accusations seriously.
"Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to come to the station so we can sort this out properly."
"You're not under arrest, but we need to verify these claims." As he spoke, Sarah spotted Dr. Peterson in the crowd, his expression showing concern and recognition. Their eyes met briefly, and he began moving toward them, but there were too many people between them for him to intervene effectively. The walk to Officer Chen's patrol car felt like a perp walk, with dozens of townspeople watching and whispering as Sarah was escorted away from the celebration. She could hear fragments of conversation speculating about her guilt and expressing outrage at the idea that someone would disrespect veterans by faking military service. At the police station, Sarah found herself in an interview room that reminded her uncomfortably of the debriefing sessions that had followed her medical discharge from the Navy. Officer Chen was professional but clearly skeptical of her claims, and she realized that without being able to provide immediate proof of her service, she was in serious legal trouble. "Look," Officer Chen said after they had covered the basic details, "I want to believe you, but you have to understand how this looks. You claim to have served, but you won't talk about it, you don't have any documentation, and now you're saying your records are classified. That's a pretty convenient excuse for someone who's making the whole thing up." Sarah stared at the table between them, fighting back tears of frustration and fear. Everything she had worked to build in Cedar Falls was crashing down around her, and there seemed to be no way to explain the truth without revealing details she wasn't authorized to discuss and wasn't psychologically ready to confront. "I need to make a phone call," she said finally, knowing that she was about to cross a line she had hoped never to approach again. Officer Chen nodded and provided her with a phone, and Sarah dialed a number she had memorized but hoped never to use. As it rang, she prayed that Captain Rodriguez was still at his duty station and available to take a call that would drag him back into a situation he had probably hoped was resolved. The phone was answered on the third ring by a voice she hadn't heard in over a year, gravelly and immediately familiar despite the time that had passed.
"Captain Rodriguez."
"Sir, this is Petty Officer Martinez," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper.
I need your help.
There was a long pause before her former commanding officer responded, and, when he did, his tone carried a mixture of concern and resignation that suggested he had been expecting this call for some time.
Where are you, Martinez? And, what kind of trouble are you in?
Captain Rodriguez listened without interruption as Sarah explained her situation, occasionally asking brief questions for clarification. His voice carried the weight of a man who had dealt with similar situations before, veterans whose classified service records created problems in civilian life, especially when their psychological wounds made them reluctant to discuss their military experiences.
Give me the contact information for this police officer, Rodriguez said after Sarah finished her explanation.
I'll handle this, Martinez, but understand that this is going to open doors you've been trying to keep closed.
Are you prepared for that?
Sarah looked through the interview room window at Officer Chen, who was speaking quietly with his supervisor while periodically glancing in her direction. Word of her arrest had apparently spread quickly through the small town, and she could see several people gathered in the station's lobby, their faces showing the kind of grim satisfaction that came from having their suspicions seemingly confirmed.
I don't have a choice, sir, she replied. They think I'm a fraud.
You're not a fraud, Martinez. You're a decorated veteran who served with distinction in some of the most dangerous operations this country has conducted.
Don't let anyone make you forget that.
Rodriguez's voice carried the authority and conviction that had made him such an effective leader.
Now put that police officer on the phone.
Sarah called Officer Chen into the room and handed him the phone, watching his expression change as Captain Rodriguez introduced himself and began explaining the situation. She could hear only one side of the conversation, but Chen's increasingly respectful tone and frequent yes, sir responses suggested that Rodriguez was having the desired effect.
He wants to speak with you again, Chen said after several minutes, handing the phone back to Sarah with a completely different demeanor than he had shown before.
Martinez, I've explained to Officer Chen that your records require special handling and that the accusations against you are unfounded. He's agreed to hold off on any charges while we sort this out properly.
However, I'm going to need to contact Admiral Hayes about this situation.
Your case is going to require his authorization to discuss.
Sarah's stomach dropped at the mention of Admiral Hayes.
She had met him only twice during her military career, both times during medal ceremonies that she had tried to forget. The idea of her situation requiring the attention of someone at that level of command made the consequences feel much more serious than she had anticipated.
Sir, is that really necessary? She asked.
Martinez, you were attached to a SEAL team conducting classified operations.
Your medical records contain details about missions that are still sensitive.
This isn't something that can be handled through normal channels. Rodriguez paused before continuing. I'm going to arrange for someone from Naval Special Warfare Command to contact that police station within the next few hours. They'll have the authority to verify your service without compromising classified information. After ending the call, Sarah found herself in the strange position of being both relieved and terrified. Her military service would be verified, clearing her of the stolen valor accusations, but the process would inevitably attract attention from people and organizations she had hoped never to deal with again. The classified nature of her service meant that several high-ranking officers would become aware of her location and situation, ending the anonymity she had worked so hard to maintain. Officer Chen returned to the interview room with a markedly different attitude, offering coffee and apologizing for the uncomfortable circumstances. I have to say, ma'am, if even half of what your captain said is true, this town owes you a significant apology.
I just wanted to be left alone, Sarah said quietly. I never claimed to be anything I wasn't. I understand that now.
But you have to see it from the community's perspective.
We've had problems with people taking advantage of folks' respect for veterans, and when someone is reluctant to talk about their service.
I get it, Sarah interrupted, not wanting to hear another explanation of why her desire for privacy had been interpreted as deception.
How long before we know something?
Your captain said within a few hours. In the meantime, you're free to go, but I'd appreciate it if you stayed in town until this gets sorted out officially. Sarah nodded and gathered her things, steeling herself for the walk through the lobby where curious townspeople were still gathered. As she passed through, she could hear whispered conversations and feel the weight of dozens of eyes following her movements. Some faces showed skepticism, others guilt at having participated in her public humiliation, but all showed an intense curiosity about who she really was.
Outside the police station, Sarah was surprised to find Dr. Peterson waiting by his car.
He approached her with the concerned expression of someone who understood the psychological toll of public scrutiny and false accusations. "I saw what happened at the parade," he said.
"How are you holding up?"
"I've been better," Sarah admitted, grateful for his presence despite her embarrassment at having her therapy sessions become relevant to a criminal investigation. "This is exactly what I was trying to avoid when I moved here."
Sometimes the things we try hardest to avoid find us anyway. It doesn't mean we were wrong to try.
Dr. Peterson leaned against his car, studying her face with professional concern.
"Do you have somewhere safe to stay while this gets resolved?"
"I imagine your apartment might not feel very private right now."
He was right.
The thought of returning to her small apartment above the bookstore, where curious neighbors and townspeople could easily find her, made Sarah's anxiety spike. She needed space to process what was happening and prepare for whatever consequences would follow the military's intervention in her situation. "I don't really have anywhere else to go," she admitted. Dr. Peterson was quiet for a moment before making a decision that seemed to surprise him as much as it did Sarah.
"My wife and I have a guest room."
"It's not much, but it's private and away from the main part of town. You're welcome to stay there until this situation gets resolved." The offer was both generous and professionally questionable, but Sarah found herself accepting gratefully. The thought of facing the curious stares and whispered conversations that would inevitably follow her around Cedar Falls was more than she could handle in her current state. Dr. Peterson's home was a modest ranch house on the outskirts of town, surrounded by trees that provided both beauty and privacy. His wife, Anne, was a retired teacher who greeted Sarah with warmth and asked no questions about the circumstances that had brought her there. Over a simple dinner, they talked about ordinary things, the weather, local politics, the challenge of maintaining a large garden, and Sarah felt some of her tension begin to ease. That evening, as she sat in their comfortable living room, Sarah's phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but the area code suggested it was from the Navy installation where Captain Rodriguez was stationed.
"Petty Officer Martinez? This is Commander Janet Walsh from Naval Special Warfare Command. I'll be handling the verification of your service record."
Commander Walsh's voice was crisp and professional, but Sarah detected an undertone of sympathy that suggested she understood the difficult position Sarah was in. They arranged to meet the following morning at the Cedar Falls police station, where Walsh would provide Officer Chen with sufficient information to clear Sarah of any wrongdoing without compromising classified details. "Martinez," Walsh said before ending the call, "I want you to know that Admiral Hayes specifically asked me to tell you that you have nothing to be ashamed of. Your service was exemplary, and your medical discharge was honorable in every sense of the word." The call left Sarah feeling simultaneously validated and hollow. After months of questioning her own worth and struggling with survivor's guilt, it was comforting to hear official confirmation that her service had been valued. But it also reminded her of everything she had lost, not just her military career, but the sense of purpose and belonging that had defined her identity for so many years. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp November weather that reminded everyone winter was approaching. Sarah had slept better than she had in weeks, partly due to the medication Dr. Peterson had prescribed and partly from the relief of knowing her situation would soon be resolved. She dressed carefully in clean jeans and a long-sleeved shirt that covered her tattoos, still instinctively trying to maintain some privacy even though she knew it would soon be irrelevant. Commander Walsh arrived at the police station in a Navy staff car, her dress blue uniform and confident bearing making it clear that this was someone with significant authority. She was younger than Sarah had expected, probably in her early 40s, with the kind of competent professionalism that marked successful naval officers.
The meeting with Officer Chen lasted less than 30 minutes.
Walsh provided him with a letter on official Naval Special Warfare Command letterhead that confirmed Sarah's service record without revealing classified details. She also showed him photographs from Sarah's military personnel file that proved her identity and verified that she had indeed served with distinction in combat operations. Petty Officer Martinez, Walsh said after Officer Chen had reviewed all the documentation, was attached to a SEAL team as their hospital corpsman. Her medical training and performance under fire saved numerous lives and contributed to the success of multiple classified operations. She received the Navy Cross, the Silver Star, and the Purple Heart, among other decorations.
Officer Chen's expression showed a mixture of respect and embarrassment as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. "Ma'am, I owe you an enormous apology. If I had known."
"You couldn't have known," Sarah replied, feeling more emotionally drained than vindicated.
"My records are classified for good reasons.
Commander Walsh stayed after Officer Chen left to prepare his report, and her demeanor became more personal as she studied Sarah's face with the concern of someone who understood combat trauma.
"How are you doing, Martinez?" "Really?"
"I'm managing," Sarah said automatically, then caught herself using the same deflection she had been employing for months.
"Actually, I'm struggling.
The transition has been harder than I expected."
Have you been getting proper treatment for your PTSD? I just started seeing someone last week. Dr. Peterson at the VA clinic. Walsh nodded approvingly. Good. And understand that what happened yesterday wasn't your fault.
The Navy should have done a better job preparing you for situations like this. She paused, seeming to wrestle with a decision before continuing.
Martinez, I'm going to tell you something that's not in your official file. Admiral Hayes has been following your case personally since your discharge.
He knows what you sacrificed and what you've been going through.
I don't understand. The Admiral lost his son in Afghanistan 2 years before your final mission.
Lieutenant Hayes was a Marine Corps officer killed in an IED explosion remarkably similar to the one that took your teammates. The Admiral sees something of his son's sacrifice in what you went through, and he's been concerned about how you were adjusting to civilian life. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had always wondered why someone at Admiral Hayes's level had personally overseen her discharge and medical care, but she had assumed it was simply due to the classified nature of her service. Learning that there was a personal element to his attention made her feel both honored and burdened by the connection. "He wanted me to give you this," Walsh continued, pulling an envelope from her briefcase. "He asked me to tell you that it's time to stop carrying your burdens alone." Inside the envelope was a handwritten letter from Admiral Hayes, along with contact information for a private treatment facility that specialized in helping special operations veterans with combat trauma. The letter was brief but powerful, expressing his personal appreciation for her service and his understanding of the challenges she faced in civilian life. "The Admiral has arranged for full funding of a comprehensive treatment program if you're interested," Walsh explained.
"It's designed specifically for veterans whose classified service makes traditional therapy challenging. No questions about operational details, just focus on healing."
Sarah stared at the letter, overwhelmed by the unexpected compassion from someone she had met only briefly years before. The offer represented an opportunity to receive the kind of specialized help she needed while maintaining the privacy she required, but it also meant acknowledging that her attempts at self-reliance had not been sufficient.
"There's something else," Walsh added. "The Admiral wanted you to know that if you ever want to return to some form of service, there are opportunities available. Not necessarily military service, but ways to use your skills and experience to help others." "I don't think I'm ready for anything like that."
"No pressure, Martinez. Just know that the option exists when and if you're ready. Right now, focus on healing."
That's an order from the Admiral, even if you're not technically under his command anymore.
As Commander Walsh prepared to leave, she handed Sarah a business card with direct contact information. "If you ever need anything, or if situations like this arise again, call me immediately. Your service record will always be classified, but that doesn't mean you have to face the consequences alone." After Walsh left, Sarah found herself alone in the police station lobby, holding letters and documents that represented both vindication and a crossroads in her recovery. The stolen valor accusations had been cleared, but the process had forced her to confront the reality that she couldn't continue hiding from her past indefinitely. Officer Chen approached her one final time, his expression showing genuine remorse. "Ms. Martinez, I want you to know that I'll be personally speaking to everyone who was involved in yesterday's incident. What happened was wrong, and the community needs to understand the mistake we made." Sarah nodded, appreciating his sincerity while doubting that any apology could fully repair the damage that had been done to her sense of safety in Cedar Falls. The town had been her refuge, the place where she could rebuild her life away from the complications of her military past. Now it felt exposed and fragile, tainted by the knowledge that her neighbors had been quick to assume the worst about her character. As she walked back toward Dr. Peterson's house, Sarah realized that she was facing a choice that would define the next phase of her life. She could return to her apartment and attempt to rebuild her reputation in Cedar Falls, hoping that time would heal the damage done by the public accusations. Or she could accept Admiral Hayes's offer of comprehensive treatment and use this crisis as an opportunity to finally address the trauma she had been avoiding for so long. The afternoon sun filtered through the bare branches of the trees lining the street, creating patterns of light and shadow that reminded her of the way sunlight had looked through the camouflage netting at forward operating bases halfway around the world. Some memories, she realized, would follow her no matter where she went or how far she ran. The question was whether she would continue to let them control her life or finally find the courage to face them directly. By the time she reached Dr. Peterson's house, Sarah had made her decision. It was time to stop running from who she had been and start building a future that honored both her service and her survival. The next few days in Cedar Falls passed in a blur of awkward encounters and half-hearted apologies. Word of Sarah's vindication had spread through the small town almost as quickly as the initial accusations, but the revelation that she was a highly decorated combat veteran created a different kind of uncomfortable attention. People who had been quick to condemn her now seemed uncertain about how to interact with someone whose service record was so distinguished yet mysterious. Sarah spent those days staying at Dr. Peterson's house, using the time to consider Admiral Hayes's offer while processing the emotional aftermath of her public humiliation. The comprehensive treatment program he had described seemed like exactly what she needed, but accepting it would mean leaving Cedar Falls and the fragile sense of normalcy she had built there. Dr. Peterson had been invaluable during this difficult period, helping her work through the complex emotions surrounding both her exposure and the unexpected support from her former command. Their sessions had taken on new depth now that the broader context of her military service was established, allowing them to address issues that had previously been off-limits due to classification concerns.
"You're facing a fundamental question about identity," he observed during one of their evening conversations.
4 months, you've been trying to be someone you're not, a civilian with no extraordinary past.
Now that your real identity has been revealed, you have to decide who you want to be going forward.
Sarah stared out the window at the quiet street, watching neighbors return home from work in the kind of predictable routine that had originally attracted her to Cedar Falls.
"I thought I could just disappear into a normal life. But normal doesn't seem to be an option for me."
Normal is overrated, and Peterson interjected from the kitchen where she was preparing dinner.
"What you need is meaningful, not normal."
The wisdom in that simple statement struck Sarah with unexpected force. She had been so focused on escaping her extraordinary past that she had never considered whether the ordinary life she was pursuing would actually fulfill her. The work at the veterinary clinic was satisfying in its way, but it engaged only a fraction of her skills and experience. She felt like a surgeon forced to work as a first aid attendant, competent but underutilized. That evening, Sarah made 2 phone calls that would change the trajectory of her recovery.
The first was to Commander Walsh, accepting Admiral Hayes's offer of comprehensive treatment with the understanding that she would need several months to complete the program.
The second was to Captain Rodriguez, asking about the opportunities for future service that Walsh had mentioned.
"There's a program run by the Department of Veterans Affairs," Rodriguez explained. "They use experienced combat medics and hospital corpsmen to help other veterans deal with transition issues and trauma.
It's not quite military service, but it uses your medical training and your understanding of what these men and women have been through." The program sounded intriguing, offering a way to use her skills in service of others who faced similar challenges to her own. But Rodriguez cautioned that she should focus on her own healing first before considering how she might help others. "Martinez, you can't pour from an empty cup. Get yourself right first, then worry about saving everyone else. That's what Admiral Hayes wants for you, and it's what your fallen teammates would want too." The mention of her lost teammates brought tears that Sarah had been holding back for days. She had been carrying survivor's guilt for so long that she had forgotten they would have wanted her to live fully, not just exist in the shadows of her former life. 2 days later, Sarah returned to her apartment above the bookstore to pack her belongings and prepare for her departure to the treatment facility. The familiar space felt different now, smaller somehow, as if her perspective on her life had fundamentally shifted. She moved through the rooms methodically, sorting through possessions that represented her attempts to build a civilian identity. There was a knock at her door as she was packing books into boxes. Sarah opened it to find Margaret Henley, the town librarian, standing in the hallway with a bouquet of flowers and an expression of profound embarrassment. "I owe you an enormous apology," Margaret said without preamble. "I was one of the people who encouraged the suspicions about your service, and I was completely wrong." Sarah invited her in, and Margaret continued her apology while helping to pack books.
"Officer Chen told us about your decorations, about what you did over there.
The Navy Cross and Silver Star, I looked them up, and I can't believe someone with that level of courage was treated the way we treated you." "You didn't know," Sarah replied, though the words felt hollow. The truth was that the community's quick assumption of her guilt had hurt more than she cared to admit.
That's no excuse.
We should have given you the benefit of the doubt, especially someone who was clearly struggling with something difficult. Margaret paused in her packing.
Is there anything we can do to make this right? Are you leaving because of what happened?
Sarah considered the question carefully. She was leaving, but not entirely because of the accusations and public humiliation. Those events had simply forced her to confront reality she had been avoiding about her mental health and her need for proper treatment. I'm leaving to get help that I should have gotten a long time ago, she said finally. What happened here just made me realize that I can't keep running from my problems.
Margaret nodded sadly. I hope you'll consider coming back someday.
This town could use someone with your character and experience. After Margaret left, Sarah continued packing while reflecting on the librarian's words. For months, she had focused on what Cedar Falls could offer her: anonymity, peace, a chance to disappear. She had never considered what she might offer the community in return, or whether her skills and experience could be valuable in civilian contexts. That afternoon, Dr. Williams stopped by to help with the heavier boxes and to express his own regrets about the situation. I should have stood up for you during that whole mess, he said. I knew there was more to your background than you were letting on, and I should have trusted my instincts about your character.
Thank you, Sarah replied. That means a lot coming from you.
I have a proposition, Dr. Williams continued.
When you're ready to come back, if you're ready to come back, I'd like to offer you a partnership in the clinic.
Your medical knowledge is far beyond what any vet tech should have, and I think you could make a real difference in this community. The offer was both generous and unexpected, representing a level of professional recognition that Sarah hadn't experienced since leaving the military. It also suggested a possible future in Cedar Falls that went beyond hiding from her past.
As the day wore on, more visitors arrived to say goodbye and offer apologies.
Frank Morrison, the veteran who had initiated the accusations at the parade, came with tears in his eyes and a bottle of expensive whiskey as a peace offering. I served 2 tours in Vietnam, he said, his voice shaking with emotion. I know what real valor looks like, and I should have recognized it in you. What I did was unforgivable. Sarah accepted his apology with grace, understanding that his actions had come from a genuine desire to protect the honor of military service, even if his methods had been misguided. They talked for over an hour about the challenges of military transition and the way combat experiences shaped veterans long after their service ended. The most surprising visitor was Jessica, the Navy veteran from the VA clinic, who arrived with dinner and an offer of friendship that transcended the professional boundaries of their previous interaction. I heard about what happened, Jessica said as they shared a meal of homemade lasagna. I wanted you to know that there are people in this community who understand what you've been going through, and we should have done better at supporting you. They talked late into the evening about the unique challenges facing female veterans, especially those who had served in combat roles that were officially restricted to men during their service. Jessica shared her own struggles with civilian transition and the way her military identity had been both a source of strength and a burden in small-town life. The thing about places like Cedar Falls, Jessica observed, is that they can be incredibly supportive once they understand what they're dealing with.
The problem is getting past the initial suspicion and misunderstanding.
Sarah found herself thinking about Jessica's words as she prepared for bed in her apartment one last time. The events of the past week had been traumatic and embarrassing, but they had also revealed a community capable of growth and redemption. The same people who had been quick to judge her had also been quick to apologize once they understood their mistake. The next morning, Sarah loaded her Honda Civic with the possessions she had decided to keep, storing the rest in the basement of the bookstore until she decided whether to return to Cedar Falls permanently. As she prepared to drive away, she was surprised to see a small crowd gathered on Main Street to see her off.
Dolores from Murphy's Diner was there with a bag of homemade cookies for her journey.
Dr. Peterson and had come to wish her well and promise continued support throughout her treatment. Even Officer Chen had taken time from his patrol duties to express his hope that she would return to Cedar Falls someday. This town won't be the same without you, Dolores said, embracing Sarah with the warmth of a surrogate grandmother.
You come back to us when you're ready, honey. We'll be here.
As Sarah drove away from Cedar Falls, she caught sight of the Veterans Memorial Wall where Staff Sergeant Michael Torres's photograph still held a place of honor among the community's fallen heroes. She thought about the conversation she had overheard in Murphy's Diner weeks earlier, when Frank Morrison had complained about young people not understanding real service. The irony was that she had been sitting right there, someone who understood all too well what service meant and what it cost, but she had been too afraid of exposure to claim her place among the community's veterans. Her attempt to hide from her past had nearly made her into the very thing she despised, someone whose service couldn't be verified or honored properly. The drive to the treatment facility took her through countryside that reminded her of the rural areas where she had grown up, before military service had taken her to places she never could have imagined. The changing landscape outside her windows felt symbolic of the journey she was beginning, leaving behind the safe but limiting life she had built in Cedar Falls to face the challenges that proper healing would require. The facility itself was located in the mountains of Colorado, designed specifically for special operations veterans whose service records presented unique challenges for traditional therapy. The buildings were modern but designed to blend into the natural landscape, creating an environment that felt both professional and peaceful. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the facility's director, greeted Sarah personally when she arrived. The shared surname was purely coincidental, but Dr. Martinez's understanding of combat trauma and classified military operations was immediately evident in the way she spoke about the program. "We work with a lot of veterans whose service records are classified or whose experiences are difficult to discuss in traditional therapeutic settings," Dr. Martinez explained as she showed Sarah to her room. "Our staff all have military backgrounds and security clearances that allow us to address the full scope of what you've been through." The room was comfortable and private, with windows overlooking mountains that reminded Sarah of deployments in Afghanistan while simultaneously offering the peace of a place where no one was trying to kill her. For the first time in months, she felt like she could breathe deeply without constantly scanning her environment for threats.
That evening, Sarah attended her first group therapy session with other veterans whose stories shared common themes with her own.
There was Marcus, an Army Ranger whose classified missions in Africa had left him struggling with nightmares and hypervigilance. Janet, a Marine Corps intelligence specialist whose work in cyber warfare had isolated her from traditional veteran support networks. And David, a former Green Beret whose medical discharge had ended a career he had planned to pursue for 20 years. As they shared their experiences in the safe environment of the group, Sarah realized that her struggles were not unique or shameful. Each of them was dealing with the challenge of integrating extraordinary experiences into ordinary civilian lives, and each had found different ways of coping with the transition. "The hardest part for me," Janet said during the session, "was feeling like I couldn't talk to anyone about what I had really done in the military. Civilian therapists would just stare at me when I tried to explain the psychological impact of my work."
Sarah nodded in understanding.
"I moved to a small town specifically to avoid having to explain my service, but that just created different problems. I ended up being accused of stolen valor because I wouldn't talk about what I had done." The group laughed sadly at the irony of her situation, but Dr. Martinez used it as a teaching moment about the importance of finding healthy ways to integrate military identity with civilian life. "You can't completely separate who you were in the military from who you are now," she explained.
"The goal isn't to forget your service or pretend it didn't happen.
The goal is to find ways to honor that experience while building a fulfilling civilian life." As the session ended and Sarah returned to her room, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months: hope that healing was actually possible. The facility offered the specialized help she needed while providing a community of people who truly understood her experiences. For the first time since her discharge, she wasn't carrying her burdens alone. That night, she slept without nightmares for the first time in over a year, and, when she woke the next morning, she felt ready to begin the hard work of reclaiming her life from the trauma that had defined it for too long. 8 months later, Sarah stood in the lobby of the Colorado treatment facility, saying goodbye to the staff and fellow veterans who had helped her reclaim her life from the trauma that had nearly destroyed it. The woman who was preparing to leave bore little resemblance to the broken, fearful person who had arrived seeking help the previous fall.
The comprehensive treatment program had been everything Admiral Hayes had promised and more.
Individual therapy sessions with Dr. Martinez had helped her process the survivor's guilt that had plagued her since the loss of her teammates, while group therapy had provided a community of understanding that she hadn't experienced since leaving the military. Most importantly, she had learned to integrate her military identity with her civilian aspirations rather than trying to compartmentalize them. "Remember what we talked about regarding disclosure," Dr. Martinez said as they completed Sarah's exit interview. "You don't owe everyone your story, but you also don't need to hide from who you are. Find the balance that feels authentic to you." The months of therapy had taught Sarah that her instinct to completely hide her military background had been as unhealthy as constant oversharing would have been. She had learned to gauge situations and relationships, sharing appropriate levels of information based on context and trust rather than defaulting to secrecy or revelation. Dr. Martinez handed her an envelope containing letters that had arrived during her treatment. Sarah had asked the staff to hold her mail during the intensive phases of therapy, wanting to focus completely on healing without outside distractions. "These came from your town in Minnesota," Dr. Martinez explained. "It seems like you made quite an impression there, despite the difficult circumstances of your departure." As Sarah drove away from the facility, she felt both excitement and nervousness about the future she was choosing. The months of treatment had clarified her priorities and helped her develop a plan that honored both her military experience and her civilian aspirations. She was ready to stop running from her past and start building a future that integrated all aspects of her identity. Her first stop was Denver, where she had arranged to meet with Captain Rodriguez, who happened to be visiting Naval Recruiting Command headquarters in the area. She found him at a coffee shop near the base, looking older than she remembered but still carrying himself with the bearing of a career naval officer. "You look different, Martinez," he observed as they settled into a corner booth with their drinks. "Healthier. More at peace." "I feel different," Sarah replied honestly. "The treatment program was exactly what I needed, even though it took me a long time to admit that." They talked for over an hour about her recovery and her plans for the future. Rodriguez listened with the attention of a commanding officer who had remained concerned about the welfare of his former sailors, asking questions that demonstrated his continued investment in her success. "I've been in contact with the Veterans Affairs program we discussed," he said, sliding a folder across the table. "They're very interested in having you join their team. Your combination of medical training and combat experience, plus your recent work on recovery from trauma, makes you uniquely qualified to help other veterans." The program was based in Minneapolis, close enough to Cedar Falls that Sarah could maintain connections there while establishing her new career helping other veterans navigate the transition to civilian life. The position would involve individual counseling, group facilitation, and outreach to veterans who were struggling with issues similar to those she had faced. "There's one other thing," Rodriguez continued, his expression growing more serious. "Admiral Hayes wanted me to personally extend an invitation for you to attend a ceremony next month honoring the teams that participated in your final mission. It's been declassified enough that they